Well, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you're beaming in from. My name is Helen Durham, and I'm the Director of International Law and Policy with the International Committee of the Red Cross, and I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this important humanitarian session on the humanitarian consequences of urban warfare. A warm welcome to our expert panellists. For those of you in the room, we value you. I know you're missing out on lunch, so deeply value your attendance here, and also all of those of us who are joining us in the digital space. Now, sadly, this is a topic of critical importance, and regrettably, it's even more relevant than ever today. We see in armed conflicts around the world, from Asia to the Middle East to Africa, to now chillingly in the heart of Europe, the issue of urban warfare is very, very important. Now, of course, cities have been a feature of violence since human beings began building them. So there's an ancient history of cities and conflict. So why should we care about the issue of urban warfare now? I think the answer is because it's become increasingly the place of conflict. And that's in the last few decades, from Aleppo to Mosul, to Sana'a, to Mogadishu, to Donetsk, and sadly today in Mariupol. These are just a few examples, and we estimate that there's over 50 million people globally who are suffering due to the impact of armed conflict and urban warfare. Now, the effects of these sort of places and locations for conflict are life-shattering, both the direct and the indirect, the short-term, medium-term and long-term effects. Preventing and mitigating these effects requires a more sustained and holistic humanitarian response than the one we often see today. But ultimately, of course, the responsibility lies with warring parties themselves to ensure that whenever fighting in urban areas is unavoidable, they do so in a manner that fully respects international humanitarian law and effectively protects civilians. Now, no region, of course, is immune to the devastating impact of urban warfare, nor should we ever accept the staggering levels of death and destruction it brings as an inevitable byproduct or consequence of armed conflict. Every passing day, reality is a stark reminder of the critical importance of IHL, international humanitarian law, especially when the conflicts take part in urban or other populated areas, putting civilians at greater risk. Now, once more, events demonstrate that the use of heavy explosive weapons to strike targets in populated areas is a major cause of civilian harm. And because, as they say, an image is worth 1,000 words, we have prepared a short, just under 3 minutes, video with testimonies from the field which clearly showcase the grave pattern of harm civilians are affected by and suffer when heavy explosive weapons are used in populated areas. So we'll show that in a minute. But together with our expert panels, we will explore the existing IHL framework, the challenges, the possible solutions regarding the growing urbanisation of warfare, and in particular, as noted, the use of explosive weapons with wide area effect. We'll also, in this session, address the ways to respond to the long-term needs affected communities, including the challenges due to the contamination by unexploded ordnance, and I think sadly this is something we in the ICRC are finding a huge challenge today, issues related to humanitarian access. We'll hear important recommendations to policymakers on measures they should take to prevent harm caused by urban warfare and to respond to the long-term impacts on affected communities. And that's what this whole forum is about, finding ways to move forward. We have to identify the solution, but also find ways to move that forward in a practical, implemented way. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible, so we will encourage people to take questions from the floor online. If you are joining us online, you can write your questions in the Siddle platform, so there's ways to engage. But before we go any further, let me introduce our panellists here today. The first speaker we have the pleasure to welcome is Ms. Anne Erie. And Anne is the Director of Advocacy and Institutional Relations for Handicapped International, Humanity and Inclusion. She holds a master's degree in development policy, and she's been working for 10 years for the Organisation of Economic Development Cooperation prior to joining Handicap International in 2003. She has extensive experience in the humanitarian sector, and she's travelled in the Middle East, in Africa and in Asia. She's collected data and produced advocacy material. She's also been involved in a number of networks and coalitions at the international level to advocate on disarmament and protections of civilians, humanitarian action or disability inclusion development policies. So we will in good hands with Anne, and thank you for being with us today. Our second speaker comes from the ICRC. I'm delighted to introduce her, Dr. Irini Gojo. Now, Irini is a legal advisor in the ICRC's Arms and Conduct of Hostilities Unit, where she works on a number of issues, from explosive weapons in populated areas and nuclear weapons. She has a number of years' experiences in multilateral disarmament and arms control diplomacy and negotiations, both inside but also outside the ICRC, and she has a PhD in international law from the University of Geneva, and I know she comes with a lot of expertise and a lot of strategic ways we can move this forward. Our final speaker is on the panel, of course, is Laura Boyo. And Laura is a program manager for Article 36 and a coordinator of the International Network on Explosive Weapons. So Laura has previously worked with the Cluster Munitions Coalition, and also prior to that she worked with the International Action Network on Small Arms. So once again, a person with significant experience and expertise on these issues we'll be reflecting on today. So before we move to the panel, I would like to ask that we show the short video, which I think locates the human issues of the fact that we need to find solutions, and this talks about the testimonies of those who have experienced this. So without further ado, I'd like to have the video.
وقعدوا يقصفوا علينا قنابل وصواريخ والوضع كان يعني سيء. أنا حالياً قاعد فوق ركام البيت اللي كان مكون من 5 طوابق 6 شقق. المستقبل لغاية هالبيت مش مبين له أي عنوان ولا مبين له أي معاني.
Юность была моя очень хорошая, а вот старость. Так разбомбили дом, все сгорело. И вот мне теперь приходится в общежитии жить.
معظم الإصابات هي عبارة عن قذائف، إصابات بقذائف طيران أو صواريخ أو ضربات دبابات، ضربات البطن، الصدر، بتر الأطراف، ضربات الرأس من الرجال، من العساكر، مختلف طبقات المجتمع تصاب بالجروح.
كلها تشردت. بيلعبوا في الدمار. نعم في الدمار. بيلعبوا ويسمعوا قال الطيارة وهربوا.
بسبب الحرب انقطع علينا أساسيات الخدمة الأساسية من ماء وكهرباء وصرف صحي إلى آخره. بسبب الحرب أصبحت الأمراض منتشرة في جميع أنحاء صنعاء وغير صنعاء.
هي حرب جديدة على القوات العراقية وخاصة من بعد 2013. الحقيقة أنه كانت حرب مدن خاصة حرب ذات طابع مختلف، حرب عصابات تحتاج أنه كفاءات وقدرات ووحدات تكتيكية خاصة بحرب المدن، ذات تدريب خاص. وكثير ما كانت يعني الانتصارات الأخيرة حسمتها وحدات تكتيكية صغيرة ومتمرسة.
Well, thank you. Very sobering and I think realistic reminder of what we're really dealing with. I'm going to start with you, Anne, if I may, without further ado. We've just obviously seen some pretty terrible images, and we know it's just not located in that place but across the world. Could you perhaps briefly inform the audience what the consequences are of bombing and shelling in towns and cities, and what impacts do these have on affected people and the communities living in these contexts? So a little bit of setting the scene for us would be great.
Okay, thank you, Helen. So what I'm going to share is what we are observing as Handicap International in the conflict context, where we work on providing humanitarian response or mine action activities. And this is really corroborated by the work of our other partners in the INU network. The fact that we observe a disproportionate impact on civilians when explosive weapons are used in populated areas. We observe a constant proportion of civilian casualties. 9 out of 10 victims' casualties are civilian, and a distinct pattern of harm when explosive weapons are used in populated areas. So we can talk of the direct impacts. When we speak of blast and fragmentation effects, we know that they are made worse in closed or semi-closed spaces that are very typical of urban areas. And also the scope of people affected is aggravated by the collapse of buildings all around. Also, the injuries caused by explosive weapons are complex and in contexts where very often access to emergency healthcare is severely hampered. So this results in lifelong impairments for survivors. And one example, in 2017 in Syria, it was estimated that at least 86,000 people had to be amputated due to injuries caused by explosive weapons. One characteristic also is the scope of psychological impact. It's really tremendous because entire communities, including children, of course, experience the terror of being trapped under the bombing, the noise, the sorrow of losing their closed one and relatives and friends, the destruction of their homes, of their hopes, and of their future. And this is really one of the elements of this pattern of harm. In Jordan, for instance, in 2019, 80% of Syrian refugees that we have been interviewing who were injured by explosive weapons showed signs of high psychological distress, as a result of which 2/3 of them were unable to carry out essential daily activities due to their emotional states. Another feature is also the massive and multiple force displacement. 2 reports by Handicap International on this issue related to the Syrian crisis has showed that the use of explosive weapons was really the primary cause for displacement, and also many of them had to be displaced multiple times, sometimes up to 25 times before they could find safe refuge. In addition to those direct impacts, we observe also what we call the reverberating effects or domino effects that multiply the damage caused by explosive weapons and increase humanitarian needs. Because bombing and shelling damage and destroy civilian infrastructure, which are vital and essential for civilians. Houses, medical facilities, hospitals, roads, electric installations, water and sewage facilities, school, etc. So, and because provision of essential services are interconnected, the range of reverberating effects on civilian lives, health and livelihoods extend well beyond the time and area of impact. We have also published a report documenting those reverberating effects in the Yemen context, and it highlighted the impact of the destruction of water, infrastructure, roads, bridges or hospitals, or the Odeda port, on food security, access to clean water, access to health and livelihoods. Finally, I would also like to insist on the specific challenges for humanitarian assistance in explosive weapons context. First, the challenge of access. Access to vital services such as emergency healthcare and basic humanitarian aid is very made difficult when impacted communities and humanitarian workers cannot leave or enter the zones which are being under attack with sufficient guarantees for their protection. Most persons with disabilities, older persons, children, persons with injuries are even more at risk. Protection of humanitarian workers is also a key issue, as well as the capacity of humanitarian organizations to interact with armed groups which are in control of the areas. A second challenge for humanitarian assistance is the challenge of providing impartial and principled humanitarian assistance for a very high number of refugees or IDPs arriving at the same time in areas where host communities are often already destabilized by the conflict. And third, there is also a need to adequately address specificities observed in EWIPA explosive weapons context when designing the humanitarian response. For instance, to answer to the scope of the psychological impact that I described earlier, or also the need to incorporate mine action-related activities in the humanitarian response plans, for instance, risk education, but also all other kind of mine action activities. So I will stop here for the moment to let the space for the other speakers.
Well, thank you, Anne. And I think it's been a very comprehensive run through of the, as you mentioned, the short term, the long term, the medium, the mental health, the whole range of issues that I think may have a massive impact. So thank you for that, setting the scene. I'm going to move now to you, Irini, because of course we know that the conduct of hostilities in urban areas is not done in a legal vacuum, so to speak. So would you maybe frame out or walk us through what are the legal frameworks and what are some of the key challenges that we face in trying to ensure that there's compliance with IHL, in particularly when using explosive weapons in populated areas?
Thanks a lot, Helen. So, it's working, right? Thanks a lot. So yes, indeed, IHL rules that regulate the conduct of hostilities also apply when fighting takes place in populated areas, urban or not. And compliance with these rules is even more critical in those cases because that is where civilians are placed at a much higher risk of harm from the conduct of hostilities. So I'll mention just a few of these rules. First of all, of course, the principle of distinction between combatants' military objectives on the one hand and civilians and civilian objects on the other. Attacks can only be directed against military objectives. Then the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, the prohibition of disproportionate attacks, obligations related to taking all feasible precautions in attack and against the effects of attacks to protect civilians. Then we have a number of more specific rules, such as the prohibition of starvation as a method of warfare, for example, the prohibition of taking human shields, rules protecting objects that are indispensable for the survival of the civilian population, but also IHL places limits on sieges as a method of warfare to ensure that sieges are only directed against enemy combatants and that civilians are in any case allowed to leave besieged areas. Now, in urban environments in particular, compliance with IHL is very difficult for a number of reasons, notably the proximity of civilians and civilian objects to the military objectives. When it comes to heavy explosive weapons in particular, the challenges are multiplied because these weapons have what we call wide area effects. Anne already mentioned this. These are effects that go well beyond the target. So in an area where civilians are concentrated, when effects go beyond the target, there is a high likelihood that they will impact civilians and civilian objects in an indiscriminate manner. So even though IHL does not prohibit the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas, it is very challenging to use them in such environments in compliance with IHL. There are significant concerns in particular related to the lack of accuracy of these weapons, which makes it very difficult to direct them against a specific military objective, as is required by the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, but also the extensive nature of the weapons, even if they are precision guided. Even if they hit the target accurately, they are often of a large explosive payload, so they cause damage and destruction over a broad area, which again raises questions with regard to the principle of proportionality as well, and of course, even more so if one considers all the reverberating effects that Anne explained very well previously. This is why we have been calling, and a number of states and the UN Secretary General as well, we have been calling for years now on states and on parties to armed conflict to avoid the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas because of the high likelihood of indiscriminate effects. And we recently published a report to this effect where we provide a number of detailed practical recommendations to states and to non-state armed groups party to conflict on measures that they can take, that they should indeed take, to better protect civilians and respect the law, in particular when it comes to the use of these weapons in populated areas.
Thank you very much. I think that is a very clear indication that there's not a framework. There is a framework, as in there's not a void, and there's steps that can be taken. And as I would encourage people to access the ICRC report on this because it's very practical and unpacks the issues in that way. But thank you for flagging the key principles that frame the activities in urban warfare from an IHL perspective. Now, Laura, I'm going to move on to you. I would really like to hear you explain to us why is there a particular focus on the use of these heavy explosive weapons in this particular context, and what is it that needs to change to strengthen protection of civilians?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Helen. I mean, what we're talking about here are weapon systems that include airdrop bombs, large missiles, other inaccurate or indirect fire weapon systems like artillery, mortars, multi-barrel rocket launchers. These are heavy explosive weapons that are very powerful weapon systems that project blast and fragmentation across a wider area. When we also see multiple munitions being launched across a wider area or issues around inaccuracy, anyone who's within that wider area is at significant risk of being killed or injured. And in the case of infrastructure, it's likely to be damaged or destroyed. So like Irene was saying, we have considerable concerns that because of the wide area effects and the effects extending beyond the military objective, that any civilians or civilian objects within that area is at risk of being harmed or destroyed. The use of these sorts of weapon systems in towns and cities and other populated areas is a major cause of civilian harm and suffering in armed conflicts that we're seeing today. And this is the case even when parties to conflict are claiming to be acting in accordance with international humanitarian law. We saw this in the video from the very distressing scenes that we saw there, and we're hearing about it a lot on the news today from the conflict that's taking place in Ukraine, with the scenes that's coming out of fighting in Mariupol and Kyiv and other major towns and cities there. But it's not just limited to what we're seeing in Ukraine. Yemen, for example, has been subject to the heaviest bombardment over the last few months than they've seen in years. We've seen fighting like this in cities in Iraq, in Syria. We saw it in Gaza and Nagorno-Karabakh last year. So this is a considerable area of concern for us, and it's a pattern of harm as well that has been documented within the INU network, that when explosive weapons are used in populated areas, 90% of the victims are civilians. So it's really the civilian population that suffers the most. And this is from data and research that we've collected now for over 10 years across a range of different contexts. So we see a very heavy civilian toll when these weapons are used in towns and cities. And we often see multiple civilian casualties in a single attack. But we also see widespread damage and destruction to infrastructure, because these are weapon systems that are able to collapse buildings. Perhaps even buildings are impacted even if they're not the target of an attack. And because public infrastructure is often located in towns and cities, it has a knock-on effect for the provision of essential services. So we see knock-on effects to the provision of healthcare, to education. It impacts water, sanitation systems, and really has a very devastating impact on the civilian population, which in times of armed conflict exacerbates the impact of conflict. So I think using these sorts of heavy explosive weapon systems is really a very inappropriate choice for fighting in towns and cities and other populated areas. From our side within INU, we want to see an end to using heavy explosive weapons in towns and cities. And like Irene was saying, there's been calls from the UN Secretary General, from the ICRC, to avoid use of explosive weapons when they have wide area effects in populated areas. And this is something we would like to see embedded in efforts around the international political declaration, which is ongoing.
Thank you very much. I think that once again builds on the issue. We've got the humanitarian consequences, the suffering, we've got the legal framework, and then we've got almost at a policy level as you're expressing there. So thank you. I'm going to go back to you, Anne, if that's okay. And if we look across the globe, we've got Yemen, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and many other contexts. The list could go on a much longer, which have experienced or continue to experience armed conflict on their territories with really devastating humanitarian consequences, particularly related to explosive weapons used in towns and cities. So Anne, can you please describe in a short way, because I think this could be a long lecture in and of itself, the situations in some of these contexts today?
I'd like to speak of the contamination once the conflict is calmed down. It's if not totally finished, and one of the problems is that the design and use of these explosive weapons are inherently inaccurate, and when they fail to explode upon impact, unexploded ordnances from artillery strikes, rockets, mortars contaminate the land of these populated areas for decades. And this contamination continues, of course, to threaten people's lives and security, even after the end of the conflict. And the contamination also prevents reconstruction of a city and a return to normal life, especially from a social and economical perspective. So if you look at access for basic services, for instance, it's very limited. In 2021 in Mosul, 9 out of 13 hospitals were damaged, limiting healthcare capacity and reducing the number of hospital beds to 30%. So it meant that fewer than 1,000 hospital beds were available for a population more than 1.8 million people. And where medical facilities have been rehabilitated, contamination of the roads, for instance, is preventing people from accessing health services, especially for certain groups, women, people with disabilities. We can speak also of livelihood opportunities that are severely impacted by contamination, and this impedes the economic recovery of a country. Another example in Iraq, in Nineveh Governorate, for instance, farmers and shepherds are often unable to access the land due to the presence of unexploded ordnance. and damages caused to irrigation water could also affect agricultural activities, and this will have impact, of course, on livelihood and food security. Also, factories and workshops contributing a lot to local economy can also be destroyed or damaged. Another impact is the fact that the population who has sought protection abroad during a conflict will be prevented from returning home after the end of hostilities due to the contamination of cities and towns, and sometimes of their own house. Different kind of reasons, such as pressure to earn income or to return home, sometimes lead to risky behavior by certain category of the population. And of course, we think of children. They are particularly at risk because they often play with these unexploded ordnance. Humanitarians will also have difficulties to reach out to contaminated areas and to provide adequate humanitarian assistance. I mentioned that earlier. And contamination in urban settings is much more complex in nature than in open fields. For instance, today, Iraq is estimated to be one of the most heavily explosive ordnance contaminated countries in the world. A total of 3,200 square kilometers of land is reported to be contaminated, and it puts 8.5 million people at risk. So, in a nutshell, what we observe is that it's always civilians who bear the brunt of such military practices.
Thank you, Anne. That's very sobering for the situation you described, situations we're seeing unfold at the moment today. And I think what really resonates with me is this idea of not over the immediate suffering, but as you noted, people returning home, the unexploded ordnance, the weapons that just, as they say, keep on killing and maiming afterwards. So thank you for that. So if we've got such a dire humanitarian situation, we then need to, of course, look at the issue of humanitarian access. And so, Irini, I'm going to turn to you. And could you share with us, please, from your experience, obviously, and the ICRC's global experience, how to assure effective and, I would say, coordinated, because that's a key issue today, humanitarian access to people in conflict areas, and, you know, to walk us through some of those issues, because there's great needs. So how do we ensure there's access?
I think this is a very, very important question, especially when conflict takes place in urban areas. The needs that are generated among the civilian population are massive. And also, especially when there is heavy bombing and shelling or a situation of siege, access to humanitarian actors is often extremely difficult, also for safety and security reasons. So Anne already mentioned a couple of elements. I would like to flag 3 issues in particular. The first is safe passage for humanitarian assistance. The second is how to respond to the massive scale of needs in a holistic and sustained manner. And the third, a very important issue, is counter-terrorism and sanctions regimes and their impact on humanitarian aid. So under IHL, there is a duty of parties to armed conflict to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage for impartial humanitarian organizations and aid, and impartial humanitarian assistance and humanitarian workers must be protected. So this is a key IHL obligation and duty that needs to be respected and will go a long way in helping aid reach populations in need and alleviate those needs. The second issue is how to respond to the scale of needs, especially when systems of critical infrastructure and essential services, systems that, as we say, are too large to fail, collapse as a result of the hostilities, usually as a result of bombing and shelling, whether directly targeted or incidentally damaged. And there, our experience has shown that often humanitarian actors alone cannot cope and cannot address these needs. And that's where partnering with development actors is a key way to ensure this sustained and holistic response. And this is why in the ICRC we have recently partnered with the World Bank and UNICEF to publish a report titled Joining Forces, with a number of recommendations for systemic changes in coordinated humanitarian/development assistance to ensure, in particular in the field of water and sanitation, but it's also applicable to other essential needs, to ensure that we can better respond to this large scale of needs. A particular issue here is also strengthening the resilience of essential services and critical infrastructure already in peacetime, to ensure that when they are impacted as a result of hostilities, they can either have built-in redundancies in the systems or rebound faster to maintain a minimum level of essential services provision. And in our integrated and multidisciplinary approach in the ICRC, we also partner with national societies who are often the first responders in urban conflict situations and our key partners. So it's really a joint and collective effort. And the last issue, very briefly, is counter-terrorism and sanctions regimes. They should not hamper humanitarian assistance and comply with the duty under IHL, again, to allow and facilitate impartial humanitarian assistance. And for that, we need humanitarian exemptions, well-crafted and lasting humanitarian exemptions for impartial humanitarian organizations, not simply derogations, to allow these impartial organizations to sustain their activities and maintain principled and effective humanitarian action. But I will close with stressing the point that ultimately the responsibility lies with the parties to armed conflict, first and foremost, to respect IHL and to take all measures they can to minimize civilian harm and to alleviate the plight of civilians, in particular in urban areas, and then humanitarian actors. Obviously, we always try to improve and adapt to the needs to see how best we can play our part.
Well, thank you, Irini. I think what I heard very clearly was the issue of safe passage, partnerships, resilience, and this idea. It's not an idea, it's a necessity. And in fact, I've had many discussions already here at this amazing forum about the importance of humanitarian carve-outs or exemptions, not derogations. We've got to allow impartial, neutral humanitarian access. Particularly when we're looking sadly at the increasing number of needs from a humanitarian perspective. So thank you for walking us through that. Now my final question goes to you, Laura, and I was wondering whether you could explain the process. It's an important and timely process towards the adoption of an international political declaration aimed at addressing the civilian harm caused by the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and how such a declaration could perhaps help us have this in military practice, help us actually implement the need to reduce the suffering, and how this could be done in concrete terms. So the political declaration would be really useful for you to explain to us.
Thanks very much, Helen, and that's right. I mean, the political declaration process is very much a humanitarian initiative. It's aimed at reducing harm to civilians, both during conflict and after conflict. It's a process led by states, but it's something that we within INU have been calling for and working on for many years now. And so our expectation is that by states agreeing to an international political declaration, it will set new international standards over the use of explosive weapons in populated areas, and really bring forward in the minds and in the actions of armed forces the humanitarian consequences and impacts of fighting in towns and cities. It can also help to promote good practice and standards for behaviour which parties are measured against. And it can also help to stigmatise harmful practices such as the use of heavy explosive weapons in towns and cities, and help to develop norms, I think, in this area. So there are a few things that we would like to see in an international political declaration do. I think one of those is that it needs to describe the problems that we're concerned about. It needs to contain in the declaration itself description of the impacts of using heavy explosive weapons in towns and cities and how that impacts civilians, both the direct impacts from the risk of being killed and injured, but also the long-term effects from using these heavy explosive weapon systems in towns and cities. So the impacts on infrastructure and essential services from damage and destruction to buildings. And it also needs to have a practical value, and you talked there about concrete commitments. It needs to have politically binding commitments in the declaration that drive forward actions that the states that sign on to this political declaration are bound by and need to implement. So I think central to this, the main commitment that we have been calling for is a commitment that will establish a presumption against the use of explosive weapons when they have wide area effects in populated areas. This will provide the strongest protection to civilians from the risk of harm. It also needs to change military policies and practices. So policies and practices should change to embed this commitment against use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas. But there's other things that militaries can and should be doing to prioritize the protection of civilians, and includes things like training and changes to other national operational policies. It also needs to provide assistance to victims. So this includes people that have been injured, as well as family members and affected communities. It needs to ensure that there's access to humanitarian assistance, even in times of fighting and conflict. And it also should be requiring militaries and other organizations to gather and share data on this issue. So that means gathering data on civilian harm and the impacts, but also gathering data on use of explosive weapons. We need to be able to track use, to be able to see if situations are getting better or they're getting worse, as well as to be able to provide operational responses to areas that have been impacted by fighting and explosive weapon use. And then lastly, it needs to establish a process of works. So we hope to see the political declaration be concluded very soon and have these commitments rather in the text, but it needs to then be implemented by states. So through the declaration, it should require parties and organizations to meet on a regular basis to review the state of play and to review implementation of the political declaration at a national level, and I think really build up a community of practice where people can meet together and share examples of good practice and policies and this working all together to strengthen the protection of civilians. So we might not see changes immediately from the agreement of this political declaration, but I think it can help to set new standards that we push on progressively over time and that helps to strengthen the protection of civilians and reduce civilian harm and suffering as a result.
Well, thank you, Laura. That was really comprehensive, and I took out of that, I heard very clearly, it needs to be concrete, but it needs to have data, it needs to be regularly reviewed, it needs to be implemented. So thank you. We're now going to open the floor, and as time is creeping on, I do have already two presentations or two interventions that we want. So the first one is from Mr. Jamie Walsh. He is the Deputy Permanent Representative of Ireland to the Conference on Disarmament at the Permanent Mission of Ireland in the UN at Geneva. He's going to obviously, I'm sure, have an opportunity to talk to us following on from you, Laura, about the political declaration. So I warmly welcome you, Jamie, to take the floor.
Thanks very much, Helen, and thanks to the ICRC for the opportunity to take the floor very briefly. I just wanted to take the floor just to mention a couple of elements and build upon what we heard just now from Laura. I also wanted to thank the panelists, by the way, for their excellent presentations, and thank the ICRC as well for arranging that very harrowing video testimony, which I think underscores the importance of achieving a strong multilaterally agreed outcome on explosive weapons. I know time is short, so I'll try to be quite brief. I think it's important just to point out that the process leading to a political declaration being led by Ireland at the moment is not operating at all in a vacuum. It builds on work of organisations very much like the ICRC and takes into account other efforts that have already taken place over a number of years. This includes issues like the joint statements at the UN General Assembly, regional conferences, and a major international conference organised by Austria in 2019. But I suppose the important part is that while these efforts have helped us to understand the scope and scale of the issues, we don't yet have a concrete multilaterally agreed outcome to address those issues. When Ireland launched the process in 2019, our objective was to initiate a type of inclusive, very transparent process through which the international community could engage quite cooperatively on elements for a political declaration. We held 2 consultations in Geneva in 2019 and early 2020, and then planned to finalise the declaration in March 2020. But unfortunately, as with all multilateral processes and life in general, our plans were pretty much frustrated by the pandemic. But despite the pandemic, we've advanced the process through other means, including through a written consultation process, a high-level webinar, and a fully virtual consultation on a revised draft of the declaration. And while all of these efforts have certainly advanced the text, delegations across the spectrum have been very clear that in-person negotiations with the full participation of capitals is necessary to resolve the outstanding issues and finalise the text on the political declaration. You mentioned as well, Helen, recent months have brought, and recent developments have given the process kind of added momentum, and needless to say, the current conflict in Ukraine has brought an enormous amount of political attention to the process. But also the debate on the protection of civilians in urban warfare at the Security Council in January, and some of the statements at the Security Council in recent weeks really stressed the importance of addressing explosive weapons through the political declaration process. If I can, I'll just move very, very briefly to the content, and this comes, of course, with the caveat that the text is still part of a live negotiation. Of course, there's a number of elements that I just wanted to highlight very briefly. Some touch upon ones that Laura has and Irene indeed have already mentioned. I guess first thing to say is that the underlying purpose of the declaration is to promote actions that are designed to reduce civilian harm from explosive weapons. The declaration won't establish, and this is very important, won't establish a prohibition on the use of any specific weapon type or seek to create any new legal obligations. And indeed, we've tried to be very clear and explicit in the text in that regard. But what the declaration does do is acknowledge the complexities and challenges of urban warfare, recognize that there's a significant problem to be addressed, and seek behavioural change. I mean, fundamentally, we want the declaration to lead to operational changes in policy and practices, which in turn will lead to better protection for civilians during armed conflict. And while there's some divergences of views on the framing of the issue itself, the need for a civilian-centred approach underpinned by a call for full respect of IHL in armed conflict is quite unambiguous throughout the declaration process. There's also a clear call that the declaration should send a strong political message to address the known harms caused by explosive weapons and emphasize both the direct and indirect consequences of their use, as we've heard throughout today. The operative commitments part, which Laura just mentioned, of course, remains inevitably one of the most challenging sections in the text. In particular, the issues around the avoidance principle are quite nuanced and complex, and they'll undoubtedly require some further negotiation and consultation. But fundamentally, for Ireland, the political declaration absolutely must have commitments that are meaningful and commitments that bring value. And I think that's the most important point to stress here. It has to convey a sense of determination that we're committed to the protection of civilians and to reducing harm. After all, I mean, that's fundamentally the reason for our engagement in this process. We also heard for greater inclusivity in any follow-on activities to ensure that not only states, but also international organizations and civil society play an active role. And that's very, very important as well for us as pen holders in this process. And then just in terms of next steps, we recently issued a revised version of the declaration, and we've scheduled consultations over the course of 3 days in April. We have to be quite flexible, I think, in terms of follow-up consultations after April, but we expect that some further in-person negotiation might be required, perhaps over 1 or 2 days in May, but there's no doubt we're entering the final stages of the negotiations. And finally, it's absolutely critical that there's collective ownership of this text as well and its implementation. After all, we hope that reaching agreement on the political declaration is really just the beginning rather than the end of this process. I'll leave it there for now, Helen. Thanks for giving me the floor, but I think it's good to leave it on that positive note of implementation. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. I think that was a great walking through of the issues. And once again, I heard this idea of not trying to create binding normative framework, but behaviour and operational change and this collective ownership. And so I wish you all the best in April. I know my colleagues will be there, and it's an important and precious opportunity I think the global community has to move this forward. I have someone else too who wants to take a moment and give us a 3-minute or less intervention from the floor. If I can welcome Mr. Amjad Yamin. He is the Director of Policy and Advocacy and Campaign for Save the Children in Yemen. And so we're delighted to have you join us to share some of the examples of the humanitarian consequences of urban warfare that we've been talking about and drawing on the Save the Children activities in Yemen. So welcome, and we're keen to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thanks a lot for the other speakers earlier for the comprehensive notes. And sorry, I'm not going to take long. I realize we may be a bit over time. But just to say that, just to join my voices to my colleagues earlier, when explosive weapons are used in urban areas, 90% of the casualties are civilians, as said, and half of them are children. And the impact doesn't extend to the direct and the obvious. We see impacts on children for years to come. We work with children in Yemen who have been unable psychologically to return to education for 2 or 3 years following an incident because of their fear that their school is going to be hit again. Recent research we just done shows that 60% of children in Yemen, for example, are afraid constantly for themselves or a member of their family will be attacked again, because almost everybody in the country has either lost a loved one, been injured themselves, or been part of an incident of an attack on a school or a hospital in just the last 7 years in the country. And to just join my voices to those calling for the declaration, because there needs to be stronger international norms and standards in protecting children in conflict. And the declaration is a really good opportunity for a new tool that can drive forward policies and practices at national level and building positive community of practice. From our perspective, the importance of socialization of norms cannot be understated. The question that we want to ask ourselves is, what kind of community are we? What kind of world do we want to live in where warring parties are able to understand, are able to see themselves in a different light? Do they see themselves as people who protect civilians while conducting hostilities? Or do they see themselves as those who will destroy anything and everything just to win or gain ground? And for us, it's particularly important that this is also another reason why the declaration is particularly important, is because it will set the scene, the norm globally, that says we will pay attention to this. And the other part is that when something like this happens, state silence cannot be understated as well. We see these deterioration of international norms and standards across the world often, and we don't hear the response from states at a global level. That is, will show parties to the conflict, will show those who are violating international law that this is not okay. And we are particularly concerned now that the more states are silent when they see these violations happen, when they see the children are killed, maimed, or schools and hospitals attacked, humanitarian access restrained, is that they will feel like they can continue to do this because nobody's watching. So we need to tell fighting parties across the world, whether we're talking about Ukraine, Syria, or Yemen, the world is watching, that the conduct of hostilities need to be done in line with international norms and standards, because this is the world we want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very important message in relation to what standards are we setting on what is acceptable and unacceptable? Now, sadly, we run out of time, but I will take one question that's online, and what I thought I'd do is I'd throw it to the panellists, and they have 1 minute each to either respond to the question or perhaps sum up. I know that's a bit tough, but we've got so much going on here at the forum. So I've got a specific question about the fact that one of you mentioned reverberating effects, and someone wanted to know a little bit more about what does that term mean. So perhaps I'll start with you, Anne. One line, if you wanted to either respond to the question or also just say your last few dot points on this critical point that we are seeing today unfold about urban warfare and particular use of weapons.
Maybe I will let the reverberating effect description to Irene, but I just like to point out that yes, Ukraine is really bringing the issue of bombing of urban areas on the front scene. And I think it makes, we have a campaign, Stop Bombing Civilian, as Handicap International. It makes this campaign more relevant than ever, and we really hope that states will commit to this political declaration and the negotiations in April, and that we will come up with a strong text endorsed by as many states as possible.
Thank you. Over to Irene.
So when we talk about reverberating effects, we refer to the indirect effects of an attack. And to visualize this, think of an explosion that damages part of the electricity network, and then there is a cutoff of electricity in an area of a city, and the hospital functioning nearby, which uses that electricity, cannot properly function. And some of the patients who are in critical life support die as a result of the power cuts. This death is an indirect result of the explosion, not a direct result, but it's still a result of the attack. In this case, an attack perhaps using a heavy explosive weapon. And from a humanitarian point of view, of course, this is extremely concerning because these reverberating effects are often long-term, and they impact a much larger part of the population than those that are in the immediate impact of the explosion. From a legal perspective, they're also very important because as long as they are reasonably foreseeable, they need to be considered when parties plan their attacks and when they conduct a proportionality assessment to conclude whether the attack will be lawful under the principle of proportionality or not. However, unfortunately, this is not always done sufficiently by parties to armed conflicts. So both from a humanitarian, but also from a legal perspective, they are extremely important.
Thank you. And the last word goes to you, Laura, on anything you'd like to say on this important topic.
Thanks very much. I mean, I think we've covered the issue of reverberating effects, but just to say that I think it really underscores the severity of harm to civilians, that this has a very long-term impact on communities. It impacts even people beyond where the attacks have occurred. And it impacts generations after generations, and we've seen it in many different countries. In Raqqa and Mosul, where upwards towards 80% of the buildings and housing was destroyed, it not only forces people to leave fighting, but it prevents people from returning to their communities and homes. And I think the question we heard just then about what kind of world do we want to live in and how do we see ourselves, and looking at the images in that video at the start, it's not that. More needs to be done to better protect civilians from the use of explosive weapons in populated areas. We have an opportunity now for setting new standards. It needs to make a meaningful difference, and we should all be working collectively to really make sure that this is felt in affected communities and it prevents future harm from happening.
Well, thank you. In a way, I don't think I could conclude any more clearly than that. We've got a problem. It has huge humanitarian consequences. We have to draw on our common humanity and understanding that there are ways to move this forward. We've got that opportunity in April. I would once again warmly thank the panelists, thank everyone who's been involved in organising this event. I think we've really covered a lot of material, a lot of statistics, a lot to absorb, but this is a question and a humanitarian issue that cannot go away, and we need to work on it with both the documents that we have in front of us, the law, the policy, but also this opportunity with a political declaration. So thank you to the panellists. Thank you to you as the audience. Thanks those online. And with that, I'd like to close this session. Thanks very much.